my next stage of my research, I wanted to then identify what style of leadership supports innovation. How do you create a culture that supports innovation in the organisation? And I started with some ethnographic case studies. So these are deep dives into an organisation. I did 2 in-depth case studies, one with an organisation over a period of 2 years, where I constantly visited the organisation, spent time immersed in it. I interviewed people at all levels through the organisation. And what was really interesting is I actually sat in on executive leadership meetings or recorded them, weekly meetings, monthly meetings, and saw the dynamics. So I started to get a feel for how executives negotiate these paradoxical challenges. And this first organisation was really interesting. It was led by a founder CEO who was highly entrepreneurial, and he'd built the organisation up over a period of 15 years so that it had become national, and he was about to go international. So he kept pushing the boundaries, pushing the boundaries. He produced over 30 highly innovative programs that were in response to his customers' needs, his clients' needs. So he was continually coming up with creative new ideas and stretching the way the organisation ran. But so much so that it started to fall apart because there were no systems and structures in place to support that. So when some new directors came in and tried to put those systems and structures in place, they were met with a challenge. They didn't cope, they left, there was a great amount of conflict, they took other people in the organisation with them, and the organisation went into crisis mode. So at this point, the board had to step in, and they said, well, let's put in a GM in place who's going to be responsible for looking after those systems and structures, so that preservation orientation. And he can counterbalance the CEO. As part of this research, I did something that's a little bit different because I wanted to tap into how people were really feeling below the surface, into that tension. So instead of just asking questions in an interview and just observing, I wanted to sort of see what they were feeling underneath. So I asked people to draw diagrams representing how they felt. And this was the diagram that the GM drew of how he felt at the beginning when he arrived. He said, you know, we're actually the 2 large circles of the CEO and the GM. He said, we're sort of disconnected. Everybody's working in silos. People are slightly aligning one way or the other, but there's not a lot of alignment. You know, we're not clear about where we're going and how we're going to get there. And he was talking about the tension between those 2 positions. It's like they're polar positions, they're polarized. And I said, well, what would be your ideal? What would you like to see? And he said, I'd like to see something like the yin and the yang symbol. So he drew this himself. That's a very paradoxical concept because you have both perspectives in synergy working together effectively. It's not one or the other. You have to have both. The light and the dark belong together. And he saw that then the executive team would fall into alignment once that was in place. So he was working hard he was working on the budget forecast, he was working on scenario planning, he was introducing technology, and it might sound basic to all of you, but he was doing simple things like SharePoint and Google Docs, things that hadn't been done in this organisation before. And he believed that that technology was going to enable innovation over the long term, sustainable innovation. My second example is a case study of an organisation that I was in for 1 year, and I did the same sort of thing. I sat in on the executive leader meetings. And the CEO of this organisation was highly innovative again himself, not so much entrepreneurial because he was in a large organisation, but he had innovative ideas, and he couldn't understand why his team and why the people in his organisation weren't also innovative. So he said, can you identify, how we can improve innovation in our organisation? And after sitting in and observing behaviours for a while, I started to notice some really interesting things. And I started to notice that every time somebody spoke up in a meeting, even in a directors' meeting, they were hesitant and they were cautious about what they said and how they said it. The CEO would inevitably sit in the corner of the room, he'd cross his arms, he had very little expression, and as soon as an idea was raised, probably without realising it, he just cut them down. He said, And he thought he was trying to be efficient. He'd say things like, we've done that before, we don't have the budget for it, we don't have time for it. And so he was limiting the freedom of expression and inadvertently stopping the innovation, stopping that freedom of thought within the organisation. But he didn't realise, because when I asked him to draw a picture of how he saw his executive team, he drew a picture of like people coming together in a circle. He said, we're still rough around the edges, we're still working out how we all fit together. It's like a puzzle, pieces of a puzzle. We're coming together. But he used words such as we're supportive, we're collaborative, we're equal-minded. And yet, when I asked somebody else in the organisation to draw how they felt about the organisation and the leadership team, this is what they drew. A boot. Scary, isn't it? With the word boss on it. And everybody else is little worker ants running around trying to keep the boss happy, trying to get his attention, and in danger of getting squashed under this big boot. And I asked the person who drew it, I said, where are you? He said, I'm that little person right on the toe of the boot, trying to get up there, but in danger of falling off and get squashed. So it took a lot of work in this organisation I had to work with the CEO himself to teach him how to embrace different perspectives, how to recognise how his behaviour impacted other people, and then to look at the organisation culture as a whole, start doing workshops and training and so on to help them to build up their creative confidence and their innovation capabilities. But as a result, we had some great results. So we had, you can see in the blue section there, an improvement in individual creative problem skills. We had people felt better about the team culture as a result, and the organisation culture overall. People felt there was an improvement where there were more ideas being generated and they were more comfortable with it. Now, if I was to ask you, I'm just going to give an example with a very well-known organisation, because this helps you to picture what I'm talking about. If I was to ask you what is one of the most creative companies in the world, just shout out some answers, please. One of the most creative companies. Apple, Google. Okay, that'll do. Good start. Google is a highly creative company. And you know, they're one of the sponsors of this event. They're known because they have the best technology, and they've developed technology over the years. Very highly creative. But even a large organisation like Google experiences these tensions and has to wrestle with these tensions. I had some time with Google at their headquarters, and we were asked to do some design thinking workshops around some challenges that they were facing, which demonstrated these tensions. And I'm not saying anything that's confidential because it was in the media at the time, but Google was accused of not connecting with the local communities. I don't know if you remember this being in the media. And what was happening was you'd have the Google employees getting in the Google bus in San Francisco, traveling down to the Google campus, where there was the Google canteen, and there was the Google swimming pool, and there was a Google dog walking park, and there was the Google gym, and they were self-sufficient, so you didn't need to do anything else. And the local communities felt like they were being bypassed and there was no connection. So even though internally Google had a very open culture of freedom, externally they weren't connecting so well with the local communities. The other thing that was happening was, in the media at the same time, there was an accusation that there wasn't enough diversity in the organisation. So if that Google bus was travelling down from the Google campus, from San Francisco to the Google campus, and there were 10 people on that bus, 8 out of the 10 people were white males. So they had to start to think about, how do we do things differently to address these challenges? And to their credit, that's why they were doing the design thinking workshops, and they've worked on that since. Let me bring it back down to a level that all of us can relate to, I'm sure, and that is the general office space. So how do these tensions emerge in the office space today? Think back in history to what the office space used to look like. So everybody used to work in cubicles, in rows, under an autocratic boss. There was not much freedom, there was no openness, there was no flexibility. You worked certain working hours. And it was not much collaboration as well. So it was a very preservation-oriented work environment to the extreme. And even when technology was introduced into the office, it was for efficiency purposes, so it was almost controlling. So you had the time stamp when you clocked in for the day and clocked out for the day, which is quite a controlling device. You had surveillance cameras were some of the first things where you could track how employees were doing their daily work, what they were doing. And then we had tracking devices, surveillance even on computers, where you can check how many emails they've got and how they're dealing with their emails, what they're doing with their time. So it's no surprise that a lot of employees became fearful of technology and mistrusted technology and thought that it was a controlling device, like Big Brother was watching them. The shift these days has been to the other extreme. So we've gone to more open plan offices. We've gone to having more collaboration. We've gone to having more connections. We've gone to more flexibility. So think about how the technology today is enabling us to be more creative, have more freedom of thought. So you can have online platforms for innovation where people can contribute ideas openly and feel free to say what they think. Feedback platforms. You can have collaboration opportunities through online platforms. And I'm not the innovation expert. This is, technology expert. This is your domain. But I'm just triggering how these principles might relate to the technologies that you're using and you're seeing coming up. You get more collaboration, you get better communication through technologies such as Yammer, and more flexibility with working hours, virtual offices, virtual teams. So it's enabling that exploration. But think about at the extreme, what's the danger? And there is a danger. Too much technology can actually be overwhelming. It can put people in a state of stress, that constant need to respond to messages. And the corticosteroids that are released when you're under pressure, under that sort of stress, can actually kill innovation, can kill creative thinking. So it literally releases a chemical that kills the brain cells in the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, and we need those memories for innovation. It impacts the striatum, which is responsible for flexibility, and we need that for creative thinking. And twice as many brain cells are killed in the process of trying to multitask as smoking marijuana. So that's scary, isn't it? A lot of us are doing the wrong drug, I think. So it has a very high impact. And you think most of us are operating in that fight or flight mode. So we're working at the primitive brainstem level that even the basic reptiles operate at, where you just respond quickly to messages as they come in and needs as they arise. Instead of the message moving through the limbic system in the center of the brain, there being a calming effect at that point, the amygdala, and then the impulses moving to the prefrontal cortex, which is where we have the time and the space to think creatively and to be innovative. So we spend so much of our time in these open offices connecting with people that we can't actually focus. And it's been shown that we need 25 minutes of uninterrupted time, focus time, to get into a creative state of flow. And yet, the statistics show that in the office, we get interrupted every 11 minutes. So it's highly impacting our productivity and our creativity. While 78% of employees say they believe that social media is important in the workplace, and 77% of them will go ahead and use social media whether you like it or not. So it's part of our lives. We have to adapt. And it's going to be a matter for organisations to work out how do you integrate that into the organisation effectively? How do you mirror what's happening in people's personal lives and make it comfortable for them in the office so that there's a reasonable balance? And 34% of employees will use social media as a mental break to escape from the everyday stresses. So how do you adapt and use that effectively so it's not too overwhelming, but so that it's effective in what it's doing?